Okay, on to my third question. Can we conceive of permissiveness as a process when set-piece battles over issues of morality so often produced unforeseen outcomes? Only one of the great court cases over permissiveness resulted in a clear-cut victory for liberalisation. That was the first, the Lady Chatterley trial of 1961, which permitted Penguin to publish several 100,000 copies of a hitherto illicit book. Other trials resulted in defeats for liberalisers or ambiguous outcomes that dissatisfied both them and moral conservatives. The permissiveness was one such case, confounding the intentions of all involved. Before the bust, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards and Marianne Faithfull worked on the assumption that they were safe enough taking drugs provided they did so in private. Their luck held prior to 1967, but was increasingly jeopardised by tabloids' desire to blow the lid on the drug-taking rampant in the pop world. Jagger therefore seized the initiative to sue the News of the World for its erroneous claim that he'd admitted to taking acid. It was actually his bandmate, Brian Jones, who had boasted to a reporter about smoking hashish. The libel action by Mick Jagger proved counterproductive because his drug-taking could not be kept secret. He loudly advertised it on his records to anyone with a rudimentary grasp of slang and puns. He associated with an assortment of shady characters, one of whom instigated the bust. He also disregarded the fact that the authorities had no intention of sanctioning drug use in private, in the manner they permitted betting and sex between men. And in suing for libel, Jagger committed the Oscar Wilde mistake, as fellow defendant Fraser put it, of goading a powerful enemy to find evidence of his wrongdoing that would stand up in court. The unintended consequences for the News of the World began when the article which sparked the Redlands Affair confused cannabis with acid and Jagger with Jones. The paper sought to prove Jagger's drug-taking to make him drop the libel case, to teach him a lesson, and to achieve vindication in the eyes of its readership. But instead, the Redlands Affair escalated into a cause célèbre in which the News of the World journalists faced as many accusations as the convicted criminals. The Stones made the mistaken but widely believed allegation that the News of the World had set them up by planting Schneiderman at the party together with his cornucopia of drugs, and the broadsheets accused the newspaper of creating the news rather than just reporting it, a charge which could just as easily have been levelled against Times editor William Rees-Mogg for his intervention into an ongoing criminal case. But the most unintended consequence of the News of the World's actions was that they revealed the drug problem at the cost of publicising and glamorising it, paradoxically encouraging the very phenomenon they sought to suppress. A scare story they published in 1967 about the heaven and hell drug prompted one group of hippies to ask themselves, where can we get some of this heaven and hell shit? The drug laws were similarly counterproductive in being at once repressive and ineffective. Robert Fraser had been caught red-handed with heroin jacks, but his behaviour was criminalised only because he lacked a prescription for them. Furthermore, the appeals court claimed in an act of pure casuistry that he was not being jailed for possession of the drugs on his person, but for having taken heroin in the first place, some time before. Mick Jagger's conviction revealed any number of problems with the law. The first was the difficulty in establishing possession, since the amphetamine tablets weren't actually his, but Faithfull's. The second was the unreliability of experts to perform their paternalistic function. A Harley Street doctor swore under oath that he gave Jagger verbal permission to use the drugs. Yet this is doubtful, to say the least, given that the pills belonged to Faithfull and that amphetamine use by the Stone Circle was no one-off event. The third problem was that the custodial sentence imposed on Jagger exposed the inadequacy of legislation which made no distinction between users and dealers, and too absolute a distinction between use of the same drugs with and without a prescription. Jagger was jailed for the unauthorised possession of 4 pills that were prescribed in their millions to ordinary people, ironically enough the subject of the Stones song Mother's Little Helper. Whereas Jagger was convicted of a crime he didn't commit, Keith Richards was eventually acquitted for a crime he had committed and continued to commit daily thereafter, that of allowing his premises to be used for the smoking of cannabis. This was because the prosecution had to prove that the general air of abandon at Redlands was a result of cannabis use, when it could just as easily have been caused by drinking, and was in fact due largely to the house party having taken acid en masse, an offence for which no one was charged. The prosecution rested its case on the high spirits and state of undress of Marianne Faithfull, who had briefly revealed all to a WPC. Prosecutors were supported in their endeavour by the press, which ran concurrent stories about Faithfull's determination to live in sin with Jagger, and by the rumour mill, which fantasised about police catching Jagger in the act of consuming a Mars bar lodged in Faithfull's vagina. In other words, an entire permissive lifestyle was put on trial, with drugs, cohabitation, exhibitionism and cunnilingus all presented as parts of a licentious whole. While legally prejudicial, the prosecution's depiction of the Stones' milieu was not far off the mark. The 7 men and 1 woman present at the house party that day represented Mary Whitehouse's worst nightmare. In addition to Faithfull, Jagger and Richards, the guests consisted of a Californian evangelist for acid, a North African houseboy whose duties extended to the sexual, a man so camp as to be mistaken for a woman by the police, an art dealer who exhibited obscene pictures and failed to pay his bills, and a hanger-on whose only claim to fame was to have fed acid to a rabbit he had dyed green. 3 of the party were gay, and 2 were bisexual. All save the designated driver had been gibbering with acid earlier in the day, and half either were heroin addicts or were shortly to become so. It was therefore unsurprising, if unwise, for Richards to rise to the prosecution's bait by defending Faithfull's nudity as entirely normal and natural. "We're not old men," he declared. "We're not worried about petty morals," thereby scuppering his lawyer's attempts to portray the accused as victims and responsible citizens. The final set of actors in this tragicomedy were liberal commentators, who superficially appeared to accomplish their objectives in the Redlands Affair. They portrayed the prosecution as a form of persecution, which would turn the generation gap into a chasm. Liberals also claimed that the exemplary sentences ran counter to the customary impartiality and moderation of British justice. Such was the gist of the celebrated Times editorial penned by William Rees-Mogg, who entitled his piece, "Who Breaks a Butterfly on a Wheel?" Rees-Mogg sought to uphold what he termed sound traditional values, such as tolerance, proportionality, judicial independence, and equality before the law. His conviction that Jagger had been incarcerated for the pettiest of crimes prompted him to chair the World in Action debate, and to authorise the publication in the Times of the Soma advertisement criticising the immoral and unworkable laws on cannabis. Yet Liberals were mistaken to believe that the Stones enjoyed the support of their generation. An NOP poll indicated that a majority of 21 to 34-year-olds thought Jagger's sentence to be not severe enough. Meanwhile, Tom Jones, Cliff Richard and Lulu, who enjoyed comparable chart success to the Rolling Stones, issued anti-drug statements in 1967, thereby demonstrating their ability to speak for the mainstream as well as sing to it. Moreover, Rees-Mogg's campaign to prevent one miscarriage of justice unwittingly helped to facilitate another, as the Stones got away with committing offences in an attempted cover-up which dwarfed those for which they were charged. They sanctioned policemen to be bribed and alleged informers to be assaulted. Keith Richards remains unapologetic for doing so, boasting in his recent autobiography that one suspected grass was adjudged innocent after having been held out of a window by his ankles, and that another never walked the same again once he was fingered as the real culprit. Miscalculations therefore drove the Redlands Affair from start to finish. The News of the World denounced the wrong Stone for taking the wrong drug. Jagger's attempts to suppress all mention of his drug taking provoked the most famous bust of the era. The raid itself was a major cock-up, as one policeman admitted, since officers failed to find what they were looking for and didn't know what to charge them, the Stones, with. Furthermore, the trial exposed the new drugs laws to be unfit for purpose in one of their major tests. Magistrates who sought to implement the law, roughly as intended, were criticised for imposing excessive sentences for insecure convictions on unreliable evidence. Both Stones were consequently freed on appeal, loudly protesting against the duplicity of the authorities, despite being habitual drug users who sought to pervert the course of justice. All in all, this was not a process directed by anybody, permissive or anti-permissive. But a process was occurring nonetheless. As journalist Tim Hewitt noted, the Redlands Affair led to a discussion of questions and social situations which until then most of Britain preferred not to think about. This was the other sense in which permissiveness was on trial. The affair engendered a debate between its principal participants, politicians, the press, the Stones, the courts and the counterculture, each of whom had sought to establish what was and what wasn't permissible in the 1960s. Some were exploring new possibilities, others were determined to establish limits, but all were engaged in a trial and error process of finding out where the boundaries lay.